Picture this. You're a young queen, barely 22 years old, lying in a bed soaked with sweat and blood in the Palace of Versailles. The year is 1778. Your body convulses with pain that tears through you like hot iron, each contraction stealing your breath, making you scream into the suffocating air. But this isn't a private moment of suffering. This isn't the intimate experience of bringing life into the world. Around your bed, pressing closer with every minute, stand 200 people. Noblemen in silk and lace, duchesses whispering behind gloved hands, palace servants craning their necks for a better view, even chimney sweeps who've climbed onto the furniture to watch you bleed. Their eyes bore into you as you writhe in agony, as your nightgown rides up exposing flesh that should never be seen by strangers, as you lose control of your body in ways that would humiliate any woman. The air is thick with the stench of unwashed bodies and expensive perfume mixing with your own blood and fluids. You can barely breathe. The candles flicker, the crowd presses closer, and as another wave of pain crashes through you, making you grip the sheets until your knuckles turn white, you realize something terrifying. You might die here, right now, in front of all these hungry, watching eyes. But here's what's even more horrifying. This isn't an accident. This isn't a tragic mistake. This is protocol. This is tradition. This is how queens are supposed to give birth. And that woman was Marie Antoinette. But here's what will truly haunt you. Marie Antoinette wasn't unlucky. She wasn't the victim of some freak accident or cruel twist of fate. What happened to her that December morning was standard procedure, required by law, mandated by tradition, expected by everyone. This is not a story about one woman's tragic birth. This is the story of a tradition so barbaric, so invasive, so deliberately cruel that it persisted for centuries across every major European royal house. From the marble palaces of France to the frozen fortresses of Russia, from medieval England to the dawn of the modern age, hundreds of royal women suffered through a nightmare that would drive any modern person to madness. They screamed while crowds cheered. They bled while nobles took notes. They nearly died while strangers climbed on furniture for a better view. And the most horrifying part, this wasn't punishment. This was privilege. This was what being a queen actually meant. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand how this horror began, we need to travel back to 1688, to the court of King James II of England. The kingdom was in chaos. Protestant nobles watched with growing alarm as their Catholic king's wife, Mary of Modena, announced her pregnancy. If she produced a male heir, it would cement Catholic rule in England for generations. But here's what nobody expected. The nobles didn't just doubt her. They accused her of planning the most elaborate deception in royal history. They claimed she would smuggle another woman's baby into the birthing chamber, hidden in a warming pan, and present it as the rightful heir. The paranoia was so intense, so all-consuming, that when Mary went into labor, they demanded something unprecedented: witnesses. Not just a few trusted advisors, but dozens of nobles, politicians, and clergy members who packed into her bedchamber to watch every moment of her suffering. They needed to see the baby emerge from her body with their own eyes. No switching, no tricks, no possibility of deception. When James Francis Edward Stuart was born, over 70 people had watched his mother's agony. They saw everything: her pain, her blood, her humiliation. But even that wasn't enough. The Protestant nobles refused to accept him as legitimate anyway, sparking the Glorious Revolution and forcing James II to flee England. The baby they'd all watched being born was declared illegitimate. The whole spectacle of public birth had been pointless. Mary of Modena's suffering had been for nothing. But the precedent was set. And here's the terrifying part. If you wanted to prove a royal birth was legitimate, you needed witnesses. Lots of them. And the more important the birth, the more witnesses you needed. What started as paranoid politics became unbreakable tradition. The practice spread like a disease through European courts. The French adopted it with particular enthusiasm. turning royal births into elaborate state occasions where the number of witnesses became a measure of the child's importance. The Russians took it even further, with empresses monitoring younger royals' births to ensure no potential threats to their power went unnoticed. By the mid-1700s, any queen or princess giving birth could expect dozens, sometimes hundreds of spectators to watch her most vulnerable moments. But what nobody talks about is why the tradition really persisted. It wasn't about preventing deception, it was about control, about reminding these powerful women that no matter how many crowns they wore, their bodies weren't their own. December 19th, 1778. Marie Antoinette had been married to Louis XVI for 8 long years. 8 years of public speculation about why she hadn't produced an heir. 8 years of vicious rumors about her fertility, her virtue, her fitness to be queen. The pressure was crushing, the scrutiny unbearable. And now, finally, she was in labor. At dawn, she rang a small bell, the signal everyone at Versailles had been waiting for. Within minutes, the palace erupted into frantic activity. Word spread through the halls like wildfire. The queen is giving birth. The heir might finally arrive. Get to her chambers. Now. But what nobody tells you about Marie Antoinette's birth is what happened in the next 60 seconds. The doors to her bedchamber burst open and people flooded in like water breaking through a dam. Not just the required witnesses, not just the royal family and high-ranking nobles. Everyone who could possibly claim the right to be there came rushing in, like princesses and duchesses in elaborate gowns that took up half the room, military officers in full dress uniform, priests clutching prayer books, palace servants abandoning their duties to catch a glimpse of history, even 2 chimney sweeps, their faces still black with soot, who climbed onto the furniture for a better view. And here's the part that will make your blood run cold. Nobody stopped them, because this was normal. The chambermaid who attended the birth later wrote an account so chilling it was hidden in palace archives for over a century. She described how the room became so packed that people were pressed against each other, unable to move. The body heat of 200 people in their heavy winter clothes, combined with the sealed windows that had been nailed shut for when turned the chamber into an oven. A literal oven. The air became thick, hard to breathe, suffocating. Marie Antoinette labored for 12 hours in that hell. 12 hours of the most intense pain a human body can experience, made worse by the heat, the lack of air, and the constant awareness of all those eyes watching her. But here's what nobody expected. The crowd was so loud, so raucous, so excited, that she could barely hear the physicians trying to help her. When people at the back couldn't see, they climbed on chairs, on tables, on anything that would give them a better view of the queen's suffering. This wasn't a medical procedure. This was entertainment. Finally, at 2 in the afternoon, the baby came. A girl, Marie-Thérèse. The crowd's disappointment was palpable, filling the room like poison gas, not the hoped-for male heir. But they stayed, pressing even closer, wanting to see the newborn princess, wanting to verify that yes, this baby had really come from the queen's body. And that's when something happened that nobody was prepared for. Marie Antoinette collapsed. The chambermaid described it in horrifying detail. The queen's face went deathly pale. Her eyes rolled back. Blood rushed to her head and she began convulsing, her body seizing in ways that made the physicians think she was dying. The crowd had literally sucked all the oxygen from the room, and the queen was suffocating. For several terrible minutes, everyone thought Marie Antoinette was dead. The room erupted into chaos. People screaming, the king crying out in anguish, physicians desperately trying to reach the queen through the crush of bodies. And still, nobody thought to clear the room. Nobody thought to give this dying woman any dignity. Finally, someone had the presence of mind to throw open the sealed windows. They had to break the boards that had been nailed over them for winter. Fresh December air rushed in, bitterly cold against the overheated room. Slowly, painfully, Marie Antoinette's eyes opened. She'd survived. Barely. For a full hour after regaining consciousness, she didn't know whether her baby was a boy or girl. She was too weak to ask, too traumatized to care. When they finally told her she had a daughter, her first words were not of disappointment, but of desperate relief tinged with something darker, something that reveals the true horror of what she'd just endured. "A son would have belonged to the state," she said, "but you are mine. You shall have my undivided care, shall share all my happiness and console me in my troubles. It was the cry of a woman who had just been reduced to an animal in front of hundreds, finding the only silver lining she could in the nightmare she'd survived. But here's what haunts historians who study this period. The trauma of that birth stayed with Marie Antoinette forever. Her ladies-in-waiting reported that she suffered what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, waking from nightmares about the crowds and the suffocation. Louis XVI, horrified by what he'd witnessed, immediately changed the rules. Marie Antoinette's subsequent 3 births would be witnessed only by close family and a handful of trusted ministers. But even that felt like a violation. Even that wasn't private. The Queen never fully recovered from the psychological damage of her first delivery. And you have to wonder, when she faced the guillotine 15 years later, did she think back to that December morning? Did she remember the crowds watching her suffer? Did dying in public feel somehow familiar? If Marie Antoinette's birth was a public nightmare, Catherine the Great's experience was something even darker, something that revealed how royal births could be weaponized as instruments of control and cruelty. The year was 1754. Catherine was not yet the Great, but a young German princess married to the mentally unstable heir to the Russian throne, Peter. The real power in Russia belonged to Empress Elizabeth, Peter's aunt, a paranoid woman who saw threats everywhere and trusted no one. But here's what makes Catherine's story truly horrifying. What happened to her wasn't an accident of tradition. It was deliberate torture disguised as protocol. When Catherine became pregnant, Elizabeth didn't see it as a joyous occasion. She saw it as a threat to her control, a potential rival heir, a situation that needed to be managed. So she did something that went beyond public birth into the realm of psychological warfare. She had Catherine moved to 2 small rooms in the summer palace and essentially imprisoned her there. For weeks before the birth, Catherine was isolated with no company except the servants Elizabeth had personally chosen to watch her. Catherine later wrote in her memoirs that she felt like a prisoner, cut off from everyone she knew, under constant surveillance, never alone even for a moment, never even for a single breath. When Catherine went into labor, Elizabeth allowed witnesses, but she controlled every aspect of the birth with an iron fist. But here's what nobody expected. Catherine labored in agony on a small, hard mattress that offered no comfort, no softness for a body being torn apart by contractions. And the very instant the baby emerged, Empress Elizabeth snatched him away. Catherine didn't get to hold her son. Didn't get to see if he was healthy. Didn't even get confirmation of his gender before Elizabeth whisked the infant out of the room, declaring him the new heir and taking personal control of his upbringing. 1 second of existence, and the child was gone. Catherine's arms remained empty. But Elizabeth's cruelty didn't end there. After giving birth, Catherine was left on the floor, not moved to her bed, not given water despite being desperately thirsty after hours of labor, not covered despite shivering from shock and exhaustion. She lay there for over 3 hours, fluids still leaking from her traumatized body, blood pooling beneath her, until finally, the midwife returned and had her moved to bed. 3 hours, lying in her own blood, while her baby was being paraded to courtiers in another part of the palace. Even then, Catherine's ordeal continued. Elizabeth kept her confined to those same small rooms for months. She was not allowed to see her baby, Paul. Her husband, Peter, who cared nothing for her, followed Elizabeth's lead and abandoned her completely. Catherine wrote later that those months were the darkest of her life, trapped in a tiny space, her body still recovering from the trauma of birth, her arms empty of the child she'd carried for 9 months, her mind slowly breaking under the isolation and hopelessness. But here's where the story takes a twist that reveals something profound about survival. That forced isolation, that deliberate cruelty, gave her something unexpected. Time to think, time to plan, time to nurse her rage into something sharp and purposeful. The woman who emerged from those rooms months later was not the same frightened girl who'd gone in. She was someone harder, someone who understood that in the Russian court, mercy was weakness and sentiment was a liability. Someone who would eventually orchestrate her husband's overthrow and rule Russia for 34 years as one of history's most powerful monarchs. The torture of her public birth had forged Catherine the Great. But you have to ask yourself, was it worth it? Did the crown justify what was done to her body, her mind, her soul? Or did something essential in her humanity die on that cold floor in the summer palace, bleeding and alone, while her baby cried in rooms she was forbidden to enter? Marie Antoinette and Catherine weren't the only ones. This tradition stretched back through generations, with each iteration adding new layers of horror and humiliation. In 1661, Marie-Thérèse, the Spanish wife of Louis XIV of France, went into labor surrounded by the full court. Princesses, dukes, and countesses packed into her rooms, their presence required by protocol to ensure no dead baby was substituted for a living one, no girl switched for a boy. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. The paranoia wasn't really about protecting the royal line. It was about something much darker. The paranoia that drove these public births was extraordinary. European courts operated on the assumption that every woman was a potential deceiver, that given the chance, a desperate queen would smuggle in another woman's baby rather than admit she'd failed to produce an heir. But here's the cruel irony. The very precautions meant to prevent deception often made such plots more likely, as the trauma of public birth led to stillbirths, which in turn increased the temptation to substitute a healthy infant. The system created the problem it claimed to solve. Margaret Beaufort's story stands out for its particular cruelty, and it reveals how young girls were sacrificed on the altar of royal succession. She was just 13 years old when she gave birth to Henry Tudor, the future Henry II of England. 13. A child herself, married off for political advantage, her body not fully developed enough to safely carry a pregnancy. She labored in agony during the War of the Roses, essentially on the run, giving birth surrounded by strangers who needed to witness the arrival of this potential heir. But what nobody tells you about Margaret's birth is the aftermath. The birth was so traumatic, so physically devastating to her underdeveloped body that she was never able to have another child. That single delivery at age 13 rendered her permanently damaged. Her pelvis was crushed, her internal organs torn beyond repair. She lived the rest of her life in chronic pain. But she lived to see her son become king, which in the cruel calculus of royal duty made all her suffering worth it. Or did it? When Margaret Beaufort looked at her son on his throne, did she think about what it cost her? Did she remember being 13 and screaming while strangers watched? Did she wonder if any crown was worth the price of her childhood, her body, her ability to ever have more children? In Spain, Portugal, Austria, and every other major European monarchy, the pattern repeated like a curse handed down through generations. Royal women giving birth surrounded by crowds, their pain turned into spectacle, their bodies inspected and judged people who saw them not as human beings, but as vessels for producing heirs. The more important the potential heir, the larger the crowd. The more desperate the need for a son, the more invasive the scrutiny. And through it all, not one of these women had any choice in the matter. But eventually, finally, something began to change. The breaking point came not from the queens themselves, but from the kings and fathers who witnessed their wives suffering and decided enough was enough. Louis XVI, after nearly losing Marie Antoinette, was the first to significantly restrict the crowds at royal births. His decision was revolutionary at the time, seen by many traditionalists as dangerous, as inviting deception and scandal. Yet even his reforms didn't go far enough. Marie Antoinette's subsequent births still included dozens of witnesses. The tradition was too entrenched, the paranoia too deep, the need for verification too politically important to simply abolish overnight. Change came slowly, incrementally, with each generation slightly loosening the grip of this barbaric custom. By the time Queen Victoria ascended the British throne in 1837, she ruled over an empire that still clung to many old traditions. When she gave birth to her first child in 1840, the Home Secretary was present in the palace, ready to verify the birth. But Victoria, known for her strong will and progressive views on many issues, began pushing back. She didn't completely eliminate witnesses, but she significantly reduced their access and insisted on more privacy than any queen before her had been granted. The real revolution came in 1948, with the birth of Prince Charles to Princess Elizabeth, who would later become Queen Elizabeth II. Her father, King George VI, made a decision that finally, after centuries of suffering, broke the tradition once and for all. He declared that no government minister would be present at the birth of his grandchildren. The Home Secretary, who had witnessed every royal birth since the practice began, would not be there. The birth would be private, attended only by medical professionals and family. It was a radical break with tradition, one that sparked controversy and debate. But George VI was adamant. He'd seen enough. He understood that the practice was cruel, unnecessary, a relic of a paranoid age that had no place in the modern world. And so, when Elizabeth went into labor with Charles, she did so knowing that no politicians, no crowds of nobles, no chimney sweeps would be climbing on furniture to watch her agony. Just doctors, nurses, and the quiet dignity every woman deserves during childbirth. Even this wasn't perfect. Prince Philip, her husband, wasn't present either. Not because of tradition, but because that's how births were handled in the 1940s. Men didn't typically attend deliveries. Philip was playing squash in another part of Buckingham Palace when Charles was born, only coming to see Elizabeth after she'd delivered via cesarean section and woken from anesthesia. But it was still progress. Slow, imperfect progress, but progress nonetheless. By the time Elizabeth gave birth to her youngest child, Edward, in 1964, things had changed even more. She'd been reading women's magazines that stressed the importance of fathers being present during birth. She wanted Philip there, wanted him to be part of the experience rather than finding out afterward. And so, for the first time in modern British royal history, a father held his wife's hand as their child was born. Philip was there for Edward's birth, a full partner in the experience, and it made all the difference. The birth was calm, private, intimate in a way royal births had never been before. Fast forward to today. When Catherine, Princess of Wales, gave birth to Prince George in 2013, she did so at St. Mary's Hospital in London, a private wing with state-of-the-art medical equipment and absolute privacy. No crowds, no witnesses beyond medical staff, no Home Secretary lurking in the hallways, just Catherine, William, and the doctors helping them bring their sons safely into the world. The contrast couldn't be more stark. Where Marie Antoinette nearly died in front of 200 gawking spectators, Catherine was able to labor and deliver in peace. Where Catherine the Great was left shivering on the floor for hours, modern royal mothers received the same excellent postnatal care as any other patient in that hospital. Where Margaret Beaufort was a 13-year-old child forced into premature motherhood under the eyes of strangers, today's royals can choose when to have children and how to experience their births. But we should be careful not to paint too rosy a picture of modern royal births. Yes, the physical privacy is there. Yes, the medical care is excellent. But royal mothers still face pressures that ordinary women don't. The media circus that greeted Catherine as she left the hospital, looking impossibly polished just hours after giving birth, represents a different kind of public scrutiny. The expectation that royal women should appear perfect, should perform their role as mothers under intense public attention, is its own form of invasion, even if it's not as brutal as what Marie Antoinette endured. The tradition of public royal births may be dead, but the assumption that royal women's bodies are somehow public property, that their reproductive choices and maternal experiences are fair game for public consumption and comment, lives on in new forms. We've moved from physical crowds in the birthing chamber to digital crowds analyzing every pregnancy photo, every childbirth detail, every parenting choice. So what do we take from this history? What does it teach us about power, about gender, about the way societies treat women's bodies when they're considered important to the state? The tradition of public royal births was never really about preventing deception. If it had been, it would have ended after the first few times. It clearly failed to prevent scandal and rumors. No, it was about something deeper and darker. It was about control, about reducing queens and princesses to their biological function, about reminding women, no matter how high-born, that their bodies weren't their own. Think about it. These were the most powerful women in the world. Queens, empresses, women who could command armies, sign death warrants, reshape nations with a word. And yet, when it came time to give birth, they had less privacy, less dignity, less autonomy than the lowliest peasant woman laboring in a cottage. A poor woman might have her mother and a midwife present. A queen had hundreds of strangers watching her bleed. The fact that this tradition persisted for centuries tells us something uncomfortable about how even the most enlightened societies can normalize cruelty when it serves the interests of power. The same courts that produced great art and literature, that advanced science and philosophy, that considered themselves the pinnacle of civilization, saw nothing wrong with turning childbirth into a public spectacle. They found ways to justify it, to make it seem necessary, to convince themselves that women's suffering in service of the state was not just acceptable, but required. Marie Antoinette, Catherine the Great, Margaret Beaufort, and countless others whose names we don't even know endured this nightmare. They survived it. Some were permanently damaged by it. Others channeled their trauma into strength and determination, but none of them should have had to experience it in the first place. Their suffering wasn't noble or necessary, it was barbaric. A tradition born from paranoia and sustained by patriarchal control masquerading as political necessity. Today, we look back on this history with horror. We can't imagine subjecting anyone to what these women endured. And yet, we should remember that future generations will look back on our time with similar horror, seeing cruelties in our treatment of women that we've normalized, that we've convinced ourselves are necessary or acceptable. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. The specifics change. The underlying dynamics of power and control often don't. The marble halls of Versailles are silent now. The rooms where Marie Antoinette nearly died are tourist attractions, their dark history sanitized for public consumption. The Summer Palace where Catherine the Great suffered her imprisonment is a museum, but their stories remain. Not as cautionary tales about obstetric care, but as reminders of what happens when we treat women's bodies as public resources, when we prioritize state interests over human dignity, when we convince ourselves that some forms of suffering are simply the price of power. These forgotten queens, these women who screamed in agony while crowds watched and whispered, deserve better than to be footnotes in history. They deserve to be remembered for what they truly were. Not just queens or empresses or royal mothers, but human beings. Women who endured the unendurable, who survived horrors we can barely imagine, who maintained their dignity and humanity despite a system designed to strip both away. In remembering their suffering, we honor not just their memory, but our obligation to ensure that such cruelty never becomes normalized again in any form, under any justification. The crowds may be gone from the birthing chambers, but the questions they raised about women's autonomy, about bodily dignity, about the price of power, remain as urgent today as they were when Marie Antoinette rang that bell on a cold December morning in 1778. And until we fully reckon with those questions, the ghosts of these forgotten queens will continue to haunt us, reminding us that civilization is measured not by its palaces and pageantry, but by how it treats its most vulnerable in their most vulnerable moments. So what do we take from this history? What does it teach us about power, about gender, about the way societies treat women's bodies when they're considered important to the state? The tradition of public royal births was never really about preventing deception. If it had been, it would have ended after the first few times it clearly failed to prevent scandal and rumors. No, it was about something deeper and darker. It was about control, about reducing queens and princesses to their biological function, about reminding women, no matter how high-born, that their bodies weren't their own. But here's what will truly disturb you when you really think about it. These were the most powerful women in the world. Queens, empresses, women who could command armies, sign death warrants, reshape nations with a word. And yet, when it came time to give birth, they had less privacy, less dignity, less autonomy than the lowliest peasant woman laboring in a cottage. A poor woman might have her mother and a midwife present. A queen had hundreds of strangers watching her bleed. That tells you everything you need to know about what power really meant for women, even at the absolute pinnacle of society. The fact that this tradition persisted for centuries tells us something comfortable about how even the most enlightened societies can normalize cruelty when it serves the interests of power. The same courts that produced great art and literature, that advanced science and philosophy, that considered themselves the pinnacle of civilization, saw nothing wrong with turning childbirth into a public spectacle. They found ways to justify it, to make it seem necessary, to convince themselves that women's suffering in service of the state was not just acceptable, but required. They made torture look like tradition. Marie Antoinette, Catherine the Great, Margaret Beaufort, and countless others whose names we don't even know endured this nightmare. They survived it. Some were permanently damaged by it. Others channeled their trauma into strength and determination, but none of them should have had to experience it in the first place. Their suffering wasn't noble or necessary. It was barbaric. A tradition born from paranoia and sustained by patriarchal control masquerading as political necessity. Today, we look back on this history with horror. We can't imagine subjecting anyone to what these women endured. And yet, we should remember that future generations will look back on our time with similar horror, seeing cruelties in our treatment of women that we've normalized, that we've convinced ourselves are necessary or acceptable. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. The specifics change. The underlying dynamics of power and control often don't. The marble halls of Versailles are silent now. The rooms where Marie Antoinette nearly died are tourist attractions, their dark history sanitized for public consumption. The summer palace where Catherine the Great suffered her imprisonment is a museum. The stones of Pembroke Castle, where 13-year-old Margaret Beaufort screamed in agony, have weathered centuries of rain and wind. But their stories remain. Not as cautionary tales about obstetric care, but as reminders of what happens when we treat women's bodies as public resources, when we prioritize state interests over human dignity, when we convince ourselves that some forms of suffering are simply the price of power. These forgotten queens, these women who screamed in agony while crowds watched and whispered, deserve better than to be footnotes in history. They deserve to be remembered for what they truly were. Not just queens or empresses or royal mothers, but human beings. Women who endured the unendurable, who survived horrors we can barely imagine, who maintained their dignity and humanity despite a system designed to strip both away. In remembering their suffering, we honor not just their memory, but our obligation to ensure that such cruelty never becomes normalized again in any form under any justification. The crowds may be gone from the birthing chambers, but the questions they raised about women's autonomy, about bodily dignity, about the price of power, remain as urgent today as they were when Marie Antoinette rang that bell on a cold December morning in 1778. And until we fully reckon with those questions, the ghosts of these forgotten queens will continue to haunt us, reminding us that civilization is measured not by its palaces and pageantry, but by how it treats its most vulnerable in their most vulnerable moments. That's the real lesson these women left us. Not in the crowns they wore, but in the suffering they endured. Not in the heirs they produced, but in the humanity they somehow managed to preserve despite everything the world did to take it from them.